Today, we're diving into an ancient logical siege, a set of arguments so powerful they tried to prove that the world you see all around you, well, that it's all just an illusion.
Seriously, what if I told you that with just a few simple, logical steps, I could prove that you can never actually stand up from your chair or walk across the room, or even just lift your finger? It sounds absolutely absurd, right? Well, almost 2,500 years ago, a brilliant philosopher built a fortress of logic so strong, so impenetrable, that it took some of the greatest minds in history, I'm talking Aristotle, the inventors of calculus, centuries to finally figure out how to break it down. Okay, so who's the guy behind all this? Meet Zeno of Elea. And you gotta understand, he wasn't just some philosopher musing in a garden, he was like a logical assassin, and he had a very specific target in his sights: reality itself. See, Zeno's mentor, a guy named Parmenides, had this wild idea that all of reality was just a single, unchanging, eternal one. Zeno's whole mission was to defend this idea. And how do you do that? Well, by proving that the alternative, our everyday world of many different moving things, is just logically impossible. His method was absolutely genius. He'd take his opponent's own beliefs and show how they led to a completely ridiculous contradiction. So, how did he do it? He laid out a series of these elegant and what seemed to be inescapable logic traps. We now know them as Zeno's paradoxes. Okay, imagine you want to walk from one side of a room to the other. Seems simple enough, right? But Zeno would stop you right there and say, hold on a second. So here's how the trap works. Before you can get all the way across the room, you have to get halfway across. Makes sense. But before you can cover that remaining half, you have to cover half of that distance, which is a quarter of the whole room. And before you do that, you have to cover half of that, and then half of that, and so on, forever. And boom, there it is. That's the trap. Zeno argues that to cross the room, you have to complete an infinite number of smaller and smaller tasks. But nobody can complete an infinite number of tasks. It's impossible. Therefore, you can't even get started. Motion itself must be an illusion. And he didn't stop there. Oh no. He argued that the legendary warrior Achilles could never catch a tortoise if he gave it a head start. He argued that a flying arrow is actually perfectly still at every single instant of its flight. The guy was just relentless. For centuries, this logical siege really held strong. But then, along comes the first hero of our story, Aristotle. And he did something brilliant. He didn't try to argue with Zeno's math. He challenged his entire concept of what infinity even is. Here's the crucial point Aristotle made. Zeno was treating the journey as an actual infinity, like it was built out of an infinite number of separate, tiny little bricks you had to lay down one by one. But Aristotle said, no, that's not right. The path is a potential infinity. It's a single, continuous whole that you could, in your mind, divide up infinitely. But you don't have to in reality. In other words, you don't actually perform an infinite number of tasks. You perform one single task, crossing the room. The infinite divisions? They're just a mental trick, a possibility, not a physical requirement. Aristotle had basically found a philosophical escape hatch. But philosophy wasn't the final word. The ultimate siege breaker, the one that blew the whole thing wide open, well, that came nearly 2,000 years later, with the invention of calculus. Calculus came along and completely reframed the problem. Instead of thinking about an infinite series of tasks, mathematicians started seeing it as a mathematical series, the sum of all those infinite halves. You know, Zeno's entire argument really rested on one simple, intuitive assumption. If you add an infinite number of positive numbers together, the answer has to be infinite. I mean, that sounds right, but is it actually true? This is where calculus delivers the absolute knockout blow, with a concept called a limit. It proved that an infinite series, as long as the pieces you're adding get smaller fast enough, doesn't just grow forever. Nope. It gets closer and closer and closer to one specific, finite number. It converges. And the solution to Zeno's paradox is just, it's so beautiful. That series, 1/2 plus a quarter plus an eighth and so on forever. It doesn't add up to infinity. It adds up to exactly one whole journey. Math proved that an infinite number of steps can be completed in a finite distance in a finite amount of time. The siege was finally broken. So you might be thinking, cool story, but Zeno was wrong, it's an ancient problem, who cares? Well, the thing is, his ghost still haunts us.
in some of the most modern places you can imagine, from computer code all the way to our biggest debates about artificial intelligence.
For instance, in programming, there's a classic error that engineers call a Zeno bug. It's what happens when a program gets stuck in a loop, trying to get closer and closer and closer to some value with infinite precision. It never quite reaches it, and eventually the whole system just crashes. That's literally Zeno's paradox playing out in silicon.
And think about something like AI rights. If you use Zeno's logic, you could argue an AI can never achieve personhood, because it would have to cross an infinite number of smaller and smaller thresholds to get there. But if you use the calculus approach, the idea of a limit, you can set a threshold of complexity and decide that once an AI crosses that line, we can treat it as a whole being. This ancient paradox gives us a powerful framework for one of the biggest ethical questions of our time.
Ultimately, Zeno taught us a really profound lesson, that pure, abstract logic, when it's totally divorced from observation and context, can lead you to deny the simple reality of walking across a room. It took a combination of new philosophical ideas and entirely new mathematics to finally find our way out. It really makes you wonder, what other simple truths are we missing right now, just because we're trapped inside the wrong kind of logic?